Вітаю, шановне товариство. Вітаю
Welcome,
колеги,
welcome, ladies
аудиторії,
and
прихильники нашої
gentlemen,
програми.
friends, colleagues, supporters of our
Дуже приємно
program.
вести цей
It
черговий
is a
семінар. Мене звуть
pleasure
Світлана
to
Мельник, і
start
я
yet
старша
another
лекторка
seminar. I'm
кафедри Слов'янських та
Svetlana Melnik,
східноєвропейських
and
мов
I
культур в
am
університеті Індіани.
the senior
Я
lecturer at Indiana
щиро
University at
вдячна
Department
всім
of Slavic and
нашим
Eastern European Languages and Cultures. And
університетам-партнерам,
I'd like to
які
express the gratitude to
долучилися до
all our
цієї
partner
програми,
universities
які
who
підтримали
chimed
наших
in and
науковців
decided to
України.
participate in this
Дуже
program and
дякую,
support
колеги.
our
Спасибі, що
scholars from
сьогодні з
Ukraine.
нами.
Thank you so much for being here
Маю
with us today,
приємність
ladies and
оголосити нашу
gentlemen.
першу
And it is
доповідачку.
a
Це
pleasure to
пані
give the floor
Галина
to our first
Олександрова. І
presenter,
пані Галина
Halyna
Олександрова,
Aleksandrova.
докторка
And Halyna
філологічних наук,
Aleksandrova
провідна
is
наукова
the PhD of
співробітниця
philology. She
Інституту
is the leading researcher
біографічних
at
досліджень
the Institute of
Національної
Biographical
бібліотеки
Studies at
України
the
імені
Vernadsky
Гнатьєва.
National Library of
Пані Галина
Ukraine.
авторка численних наукових
Halyna is
публікацій,
the author of
статей
multiple
монографій.
publications, and
Наукові
among them are
зацікавлення пані
2
Галини включають
monographs.
літературу 19
Her interests cover
століття, першої
literature of the
половини 20
19th
століття,
century, early
українських та
20th
біографічних
century,
studies.
comparative
Зокрема, зараз пані
literature,
Галина
and
працює
biography
над створенням
studies.
бібліографії
Halyna works
відомого
on
і
creating a
біографії відомого
bibliography and biography
літературознавця
of a
Миколи Куліча Стороженка. І
well-known
сьогоднішня її доповідь про
literary
осмислення
researcher Mykola
культурної
Storozhenko. And
спадщини і
today she will
біографічних
be
дослідженнях.
presenting the
Повернення
following
імен українців у
research,
національний
Rethinking the Russian
культурний
Imperial
простір.
Heritage in
Перш
Biographical
ніж
Studies,
пані
returning the
Галина
names of Ukrainians
розпочне
to the
свою
national cultural
доповідь,
space.
я хочу
Before
нагадати, що
Halyna
вона
takes over the floor,
входить
I'd like to
до нашої
remind you that
викладачки дня на
we have
першому стіл.
interpreters,
І ви
Yana and
можете
Anastasia,
зробити
working with us
канал
today.
мовлення,
And I'd
клацнути
like to remind you
на
that you can enable
глобус
interpretation
внизу
by
у
clicking
стрічці
more,
знизу,
3
і
dots,
там вибрати
then
або
globe
англомовний,
icon with
або
interpretation,
україномовний.
and choose
Спасибі,
either
шановні
English
колеги, пані
or
Галина,
Ukrainian. Thank you. Halyna, over to you.
Доброго дня, шановні колеги. Отже, тема моєї доповіді
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. So today I will be speaking about rethinking the Russian imperial heritage in biographical studies, returning the names of Ukrainians to the national cultural space. For over 3 decades, our society has been confronting several urgent tasks: preserving historical memory, affirming national identity, discovering famous and lesser-known Ukrainian
Повномасштабна війна стала
and
каталізатором
Soviet historical space. The full-scale war became a catalyst for accelerating the process of removing many names and titles from the cultural space of Ukraine to reduce the influence of Imperial Soviet narratives on the worldview of Ukrainians. After all, the distortion, twisting, and reshuffling of historical facts began during the Imperial times, continued through the Soviet era, and persists in contemporary media, information, communications, etc. This compels us to rethink the biographies of those Ukrainian figures who were perceived as the representatives of purely Russian science and culture. Ukrainian plots are still often viewed through a Russian lens, in particular, as the Austrian researcher Kepler notes, in a format of the so-called confused or intertwined history. In the light of the current political situation and the full-scale invasion of the Russian Federation into Ukraine, aggressive attempts to destroy Ukrainian identity and state independence, it is worth remembering the constant attempts to appropriate not only our territories, but also the vast Ukrainian scientific, cultural, and artistic heritage. This includes figures such as Maxim Berezovsky, Dmitro Bortnyansky, Artemy Vedel, Gogol, Bodansky, Kostomarov, Mordovets, Repin, Burluk, Malevich, as well as Nemirovich Danchenko. The roots of many, well, I don't want to give the names of the writers. Basically, Kremlin propaganda simply denoted them as Russians. And the current challenging times demand new approaches to biographical research, which can only be realized through innovative approaches to sourcing. On the one hand, we must overcome the thinking stereotypes rooted in the imperial Russian heritage. And on the other, we must build a new model of collective memory that recognizes Ukrainians whose scientific heritage was appropriated by the metropolitan state, eliminating their names from the spiritual space of their own people. It is now that our society places extremely high demands on culture, on the presence of figures whose merits are significant both historically and in the present. Therefore, the form that the national biographical space takes amid the latest challenges and social-cultural changes is crucial for Ukraine. Our canon of historical figures remains incomplete, and regrettably, extraordinary individuals have ended up left out. This means that we do not understand the historical significance of certain people. We do not know their biography, nor do we know the reasons behind forgetting or silencing their merits. Ukrainians have been living across the globe, yet we often know more about our compatriots on distant continents than about those who lived in the capitals of empire. Of course, here we should mention Volodymyr Serhiychuk, Vladimir Melnichenko, Tatiana Dubudintseva, Johann Sverstyuk, and others. And it might seem that back in 1990s, we tried to fill all the gaps, blind spots, but still up to this very date, many layers of national culture have been given to Russians, the Russian-speaking domain. That is why it should be the axiom, bringing back the names of Ukrainians, those who deserve to be the part of our culture. Ivan Lysak-Rudnitsky, well-known historian, said that the intellectual history of Ukraine should also pay attention to those scientists who worked in Russian universities, who were publishing their works in Russian, but nevertheless kept in touch with the Ukrainian movement, and their thinking structure, according to him, demonstrated their Ukrainian moves. During the independence, the society was faced with the challenge of looking for their national identity and trying to be separated from Soviet and Russian context, especially when it comes to the personal aspect. Currently, it's important to broaden this list of names. That is why it is still relevant to look into the activity of Ukrainians who worked in the Russian Empire and whose achievements were stolen by the neighbors without mentioning their roots whatsoever. It is known that intellectual and cultural potential for centuries were taken from Ukraine, which served as a kind of a donor to the metropolitan state, starting with the times of Peter I. The best intellectuals from Ukraine were coming to the capitals and empire and stayed there, where the main libraries were centered, where there was more cultural exchange, where there was more European experience. For the 18th and the 19th century, the brain drain, incorporation process was happening when Ukrainian intelligentsia was moving to the Russian Empire. And they were trying to do everything possible to assimilate them, to make them part of Russian culture. In the early 19th century, when Ukraine has already turned into the Imperial province, its talented youth continued actualizing its cultural potential in the colonizer state. According to Olena Pchilka, having provided to semi-world Moscovia all of its potential, Ukraine was losing its national peculiarities. It was declining, started forgetting about its historical name, and having become Little Russia, has been completely hidden within the Russian Empire. The imperial Russificators were trying to deprive the Ukrainian people of their intelligence, a small group of people that absorbs and develops historical and spiritual values. All three universities that were established in Ukraine in the 19th century up to the early 20th century were considered to be provincial, and Ukrainian science was doomed to be merely a part of the imperial science. And most Ukrainian nobility barely resisted this state of affairs, but still, back in the day, were sticking to the Little Russian way of thinking and was trying to help develop Ukrainian art, science, and research. In Moscow and St. Petersburg, Ukrainians managed to create the so-called colony, a special cultural world. People who came from Ukraine, graduated from the university, they oftentimes decided to stay in the metropolitan domain. And I would like to briefly talk about two very important personalities. To give you an example of how Ukrainians were living and working in Russia. Well, the first figure is well-known Gogol. His destiny is a classical example that allows us to understand the split identity of a person who needs to pick between the empire and their motherland, between their national culture and somebody else's culture. And the fate of the most renowned Ukrainian, Taras Shevchenko, is absolutely opposite from the Gogol's one. Spending the vast majority of his life there, he managed to breathe new life into the historical memory, Ukrainian culture. And I would like to mention other, maybe less known and prominent Ukrainians whose life was also connected to the capitals and empire, mostly researchers and writers. So an entire Moscow University in the second half of the 19th century was filled with teachers and students who came from Ukraine. It basically existed thanks to them. The Imperial science was trying to suck more and more resources from their province. The Ukrainian impact was the crucial one, and they played the main role in developing culture and science. Now, let us take a look at Timofey Granovsky, who was a luminary in the Moscow University in late 1850s. He was a historian and a public figure. He hailed from a family of a Ukrainian landowner in Nizhyn. Well, you might read that he was born in Orol, but he spent most of his life in Nizhyn. This is a renowned professor humanist, a Westerner in his worldview. Sadly, he died at the age of 42, but those who attended at least a few of his lectures were left with a lasting impression. According to memoirs, this teacher had a little Russian southern physiognomy. His extraordinary beauty made a powerful impact. Fyodor Buslaev, a professor at Moscow University and a notable researcher of Ukrainian monuments, wrote, emphasizing the features of Granovsky's Ukrainian character. I knew no one in the world better than Granovsky, perfect in every nature, and indulgence knew no bounds. He was unaware of his own worth and selflessly placed others before himself. With his impeccable worldly courtesy and playful and malignant wit, he was the soul of every conversation. And Granovsky had a significant intellectual influence on Ukrainian scholars and historians, particularly on Professor Mikhailo Lunin of Kharkiv University, who was often referred to as the Ukrainian Granovsky. Now let us move on. So the next one is the outstanding Slavic scholar Osip Bodansky. Well, he is firmly recognized as part of the Ukrainian circle of Ukrainian figures. So when we're mentioning Samarov, Kulish, Maximovich, there's Bodansky also among those names. And this is thanks to our linguists who didn't let Russians hold on to him, even though they also consider him to be a part of their culture. Because after he graduated from Peryaslav Seminary, he enrolled into Moscow University. After that, he became a teacher. In 1837, he defended his thesis dedicated to the folk poetry of the Slavic tribes. And there he highlighted the uniqueness of the Ukrainian language. Once again, I'd like to remind you that it happened in 1837. He was writing about the uniqueness of the Ukrainian language and the distinctiveness of Ukrainian spoken folk art. He spent 5 years traveling through Western and Southern Slavic countries, and he was fluent in all Slavic languages. However, when he spoke at meetings of the Academic Council at Moscow University, he needed an interpreter because, as others say, he had a very thick Ukrainian accent, and he was doing that knowingly, because he did not only shy away from his Ukrainian heritage, but made every effort to emphasize his belonging to the Ukrainian nation. And he was even titled Ukrainizer of Moscow. His permanent work of Moscow University, because he sadly did not visit Ukraine oftentimes, did not prevent him from obtaining the title of honored worker in the field of Ukrainian studies in Russia. He was the one who introduced significant Ukrainian books into the scholarly world, such as First Gospel, the Constitution of Philip Orlik, the Chronicle of Samovitz, and the History of Rus, among many others. And he was also publishing the journal dedicated to Russian history. I'm sorry that when I'm presenting in Ukrainian, I'm mentioning some titles in Russian. And according to his student, he was always trying to stay independent when it came to thoughts. And his circle consisted of fellow countrymen, Gogol, Shevchenko, and others. Despite his connections with fellow Ukrainians, the professor maintained high standards for his students, particularly when it came to exams. For instance, when his compatriot that we mentioned earlier, Timofey Granovsky, when he was defeating his cities, but else he voted against it. And now let us move to the next slide. This is Alexander Katarevsky, a prominent figure in Moscow. People said that he was a native, enormous scientific force. He hailed from Kremenchuk in the Poltava Oblast and was an ethnographer, Slavist publicist, and he was also a student of Osip Bodansky. The contemporaries were mentioning his little Russian humor and wit, which became the key to every conversation. He taught at Dobrat University, and the final years of his life were spent teaching in Kiev at St. Volodymyr's University. He was one of the best researchers when it came to Ukrainian literature. Back in 1868, he wrote, "Let the poetic activity of our native land in its native language receive universal recognition and respect." Now, next is another prominent figure who worked outside Ukraine, is Danilo Mordovits Slipchenko, a writer and publicist from an ancient Cossack family. However, his father was a merchant and former Zaporozhian, changed the family to the Russian Mordovtsev. In 1854, Danilo graduated from the Faculty of History and Philology at St. Petersburg University. He authored historical works as well as everyday fiction.
Ivan Franko called him a writer with a double literary physiognomy, since he was writing both in Ukrainian and Russian. But despite these events, he still remained and preserved his Ukrainian identity. And he was raised in the environment of his native language. His great-grandfather, Ivan Milošević Slipchenko-Mordovits, along with other fellow countrymen, left their homeland and settled in Danilivka settlement. That settlement was the place where Ukrainians lived. His great-grandfather was associated with Hetman Mazepa, and he preserved the archive of secret Kazakh army documents. Danilo Mordovits knew Shevchenko and Mykola Kostomarov, and he left memoirs about them. And the list of Ukrainian figures working with the empire could go on. These notable names include Shepkin, Bogdanovich, Naryzhny, Hrbinka, Trutovsky, Karazin, Mrezhenki, Stakivsky, Dashkevich, Nemirovich, Danchenko, and others. Mykola Ilyich Storozhenko was also among those Ukrainians who worked in Russia. And I would like to bring your attention to the fact that while speaking about Storozhenkis, I will also mention their second names, since there was more than one Mykola Storozhenko. Mykola Ilyich Storozhenko is a descendant of a Ukrainian Kazakh family dating back to the early 17th century. And since 1785, his ancestors became nobles. The Storozhenkos held a special place within the system of family and social ties in the 19th century Ukrainian society, and they were part of the Ukrainian elite. And now let's speak about the family. This is Andrei Yakovich Storozhenko. He had a nickname of Tsarini, a hero of the War of 1812, collector, writer, ethnographer, historian, and an author of first Ukrainian operas that were called Zaporizhzhia Siege. And he is also known for preserving an invaluable treasure, the register of the Zaporizhzhia army of 1649, which was published by Osip Budansky in his um, magazine. This is Aleksa Petrovich Storozhenko. He was a writer and also criminologist by his formal education and a military man. He wrote in Russian, unfortunately.
Теж перепрошую, називаю їх мовою оригіналу. Роман «Братья-близнецы».
He authored the following literary pieces. The novel Twin Brothers, Братья-близнецы. And he also was an author of essays from the Little Russia of the 20th century. And the collection of stories, stories from the peasant life of Little Russians. Besides, he also authored humorous stories and the novel Marco the Cursed. Another Andrei, but Andrei Volodymyrovich Storozhenko, who also took the alias of his grandfather, Tsariny. Another Mykola Storozhenko, Mykola Volodymyrovich Storozhenko, who was a historian and teacher of Kiev Gymnasium. Mykola Volodymyrovich and Mykola Ilyich Storozhenko were often confused, since both of them were authors of articles that were published in Kievska Starina magazine. And if there was no initial after the first name, there was the confusion who was actually the author. At the beginning of the 20th century, these two brothers, Mykola Volodymyrovich and Andrei Volodymyrovich Storozhenko, published a detailed family archive, which became a significant piece for Ukrainian educational archaeology and an important source of information for Ukrainian biographical studies. The interest in the past was only growing, and they were trying to understand their present and their identity by looking and reflecting into the history of their family and in the past. Many researchers have shown interest in the genealogy of the Storozhenko family. Among those are Bonda, Gordienko, Kozuk, Pazura, Putra, Tomazov, Ulanovsky, and others.
Оцих братів-істориків Миколи Володимировича та Андрія
Volodymyrovich and Mykola
антиукраїнські погляди.
and Andrei Volodymyrovich Storozhenky caused a lot of interest to their figures. However, the figure of Mykola Ilyich Storozhenko, who remained a staunch Ukrainian until his death, has yet to be fully integrated back into the broader national family. And these brothers even had their anti-Ukrainian views since 1908. They were members of the Club of Russian Nationalists in Kiev. And we have to distinguish between these two. Mykola Ilyich Storozhenko's biography is an example of the person who preserved his Ukrainian identity and was able to succeed in science, yet bearing in mind that he originates from Ukraine. Mykola Ilyich Storozhenko was born on the 22nd of May 1836 in the village of Irzhavets, Priluki district, Chernihiv Oblast. He was born at his mother Halyna Tishkevich's estate. Well, she is not from Poland. Her last name used to be Tishkiv, but they changed it to Tishkevich. And later on, they moved to the village of Marmizivka, Lochwitsa district, Poltava Oblast. His mother tongue was Ukrainian, and he could have become representative of Ukrainian culture. However, at that time, there was no atmosphere of Ukrainian speaking education at the first Kiev gymnasium where he studied. And unfortunately, this environment didn't nurture a national consciousness of Mykola Storozhenko.
літератури в університеті Святого Володимира. Йти до нього
His
вчитися я
literature teacher,
Теж
Andrei
не
Linichenko, was
Отже, син,
an
цікава
adaptionist,
цитата,
and
син
he didn't
оцього
foster ties
Стороженка
with
старшого,
anything
Андрія,
Ukrainian.
перепрошую, Андрія Линиченка,
Linichenko's son,
Іван
historian
Линиченко,
Ivan
писав свого
Linichenko,
такого
later
спогадував.
recalled
Мій батько
that his
про цього
father,
вчителя гімназії, першої
although
української
a
гімназії.
little Russian of
Мій батько, хоч і мало вуз
origin,
чистішої води за походженням,
always
то
stood
як
for
завжди
the
на загальному
all-Russian
точне
point
зло.
of view
Із
and
українофілами
didn't
не
agree with
сходився, а вони
the
його вважали, якщо не москаля,
Ukrainophiles,
то
and they
русський.
considered him, if not a Muscovite,
І
then a
долевою
renegade.
для випускника гімназії Миколи Стороженка була зустріч із
Mykola
тим, кого ми сьогодні
Storozhenko
постійно згадуємо.
met an important figure in his life. We have already mentioned this historic figure previously, Osip Bodansky. Mykola Storozhenko's father, Ilya, insisted that his son enroll at the University of Saint Volodymyr in Kiev, that has been open for 20 years already at that time. However, Osip Bodansky, being Mykola Storozhenko's father's friend, talked him out of it. He was from the town of Barvy, which was neighboring to the village of Marmizivka. And since Osip Bodansky was teaching at Moscow University, he convinced Mykola Storozhenko that he should enroll in Moscow University. And it is worth mentioning that the University of St. Volodymyr had a more local reputation and a lower status. Except for its first rector, Mikhailo Maximovich, the university's teachers showed little interest in Ukrainian culture, and Mikhailo Maximovich actually had to resign.
Університету Святого Володимира не виявляли інтересу. Вони були або сполонізовані, або русифіковані.
The faculty at St. Volodymyr's University were rather pro-Russian, and no one was trying to promote Ukrainian culture and bring conscious Ukrainian identity. Being an ambitious young man, Mykola Storozhenko wanted to grow and develop. Therefore, under the influence of his father's friend, Mykola Storozhenko entered the Department of History and Philology at Moscow University in 1855. His first published work was, as a student, was a review of Danilo Mordovtsev's Little Russian Literary Collection. We have mentioned that earlier today. That was a collection of works that was published in Saratov in 1859.
Що у 12 столітті існувало наріччя, яким говорила тодішня Київська Русь.
Старozhenko wrote in his review, in the 12th century there was already Ukrainian dialect, and that is the foundation for our language. And he didn't use the term Little Russian, he used the term Ukrainian. Apart from that, he also wrote the publication on Kulish, his review on Kulish, but unfortunately that information was lost. In a letter dated the 3rd of March 1857, to his cousin Volodymyr Starozhenko, Mykola Starozhenko wrote, "In moments of leisure and while being in a cheerful mood, I continued to study the history of Little Russia, and I have managed to prepare a short article about Kulish's publication of notes on southern Russia. I want to submit it to Russian Vestnik, but I'm not sure if they will accept it." There was a lot of information about the various events like Shevchenko evenings, where Mykola Staroshenko met many fellow countrymen. This is what he wrote about those evenings. These evenings have a purely national character. They speak entirely in Little Russian. Chumachevsky and Artemovsky sing Little Russian songs. In short, this is the avant-garde of Little Russia, which has been revived. Actually, he even had a nickname, Nesvaiba, and all Mykola's classmates believed that he would become a famous writer, since he had a remarkable talent for artistically recounting various life stories. But life took a different turn. He actually authored several children's fairy tales and a play titled The Triple Bridegroom. However, due to the adoption of Valuyev Circular in 1863, which banned publication in Ukrainian, Starozhenko was not able to write in Ukrainian anymore. Therefore, he had to find something else, and he became fascinated by the works of Shakespeare, whose 300th anniversary was been widely celebrated globally. In early 1864, Starozhenko gave 5 public lectures on Shakespeare. At that time, Starozhenko was a teacher in Moscow Gymnasium. The famous writer Ivan Prizhov, author of Little Russia in the History of its Literature, from the 18th to the 18th, from the 11th to the 18th century, wrote an enthusiastic review of the lectures that were delivered by Starozhenko. Mykola's father was very content with that review, and he sent a substantial amount of money to his son. Starozhenko used these funds to travel to France and England, and he took 4 trips abroad. He was working on the history of his homeland nonetheless. In 1870, he published invaluable primary sources related to the history of Ukraine with a foreword written by Bodansky. When Starozhenko went back to Moscow after his trip to London, he started preparing for his master's exam. Mykola Starozhenko very much fascinated by Osip Bodansky, and he kept on communicating with his professor even after his graduation. There are letters sent from Sergenko to Bodansky. 7 of them, they were published only last year. And Sergenko always kept a portrait of his beloved professor above his desk. Mykola Sergenko had his career grow in Russia. In 1872, he defended his master's thesis in St. Petersburg and his PhD thesis in 1878. Serozhenko's achievements were so impressive that he was appointed head of the Department of General Literature, which later on was renamed into the Department of Foreign Literature. It means that in the whole empire, there was no other specialist of this kind when it came to the foreign literature. Apart from that, he was elected as the vice president of the new Shakespeare Society in London. He had other titles, and yet he understood that due to the ban on the Ukrainian language, he was not able to pursue the Ukrainian literature path. Therefore, he had to look for a different area of interest, and that is why he resorted to Shakespearean studies. In 1893, Mykola Serozhenko was appointed chief librarian of the Rumyantsev Museum. This is the state library until now. He reorganized the museum library following the model of the British Museum in London, where he used to work a lot. He also, on his own initiative, established a separate publicly accessible science library and the reading room, and that library was regularly updated. In 1899, he was elected a corresponding member of the Imperial Academy of Sciences. He died on the 25th of January 1906 in Moscow. It seems like Serozhenko became one of the representatives of Russian intellectuals, but recently published archival documents reveal that Mykola Ilyich was under police surveillance even during his studies in London, and he could not have expected to teach in Ukraine. It means that the circumstances for the Ukrainian researchers were very difficult, and they were hindrances on their path. In particular, we should pay attention to the attitude of Halyna towards Storozhenko, since she didn't want to compromise when it came to the traitors of Ukraine. And according to Halyna Storozhenko was a great force. He was a researcher with a great name and an outstanding representative of the national type. And she actually pointed out two aspects of his work, Moscow University and his connection to his motherland, viewing him as an example of how a scientist and a public figure could combine their efforts. Serozhenko knew many prominent figures of Ukrainian literary circles and Ukrainian academia. He knew personally not only Halyna Pchilka, but also Mikhailo Dragomanov, Panas Mirny, Mikhailo Staritsky, Volodymyr Antonovich, Lashkevich, Naumenko.
And we would like to emphasize that the Storozhenko work in Ukraine was emphasized by a few factors. First, him being friend was also Bodansky, who personally knew Taras Shevchenko. And of course, therefore, He also basically inherited this interest to Shevchenko studies. He's the author of 19 publications dedicated to Shevchenko. One more thing, in 81, his second nephew, Mykola Volodymyrovich Storozhenko, enrolled into St. Vladimir's University. And then Mykola Ilyich started to exchange letters with him. And he becomes the intermediary between Moscow Mykola and Ukrainian intelligentsia. The third one is the establishment of the journal Kievskaya Starina in 1882. It was an important Ukrainian studies journal that gave significant attention to materials about Taras Shevchenko, and Storozhenko had the opportunity to publish his articles there. And the fourth one is inheriting his father's, Ilya Yakovich's estate in the village of Murmizivka. Because when the father died, he was the only person left to inherit it. And Storozhenko didn't go anywhere. He didn't go abroad. No matter how much the doctors recommended him to go to Yessentuki, he said, I'm going to go to Murmizivka and I'm going to write on my gates that this is the well number 5. So, you know, reading those letters that were mailed from Murmizivka to Moscow are so much fun. He was writing about how he's growing poppy seeds, tobacco, how some stuff is getting stolen by his manager from Kiev. He was sending letters to his colleagues, to his students. He was recommending them what the topic of their master's paper should be. So there are lots of memories where you can feel the true nature and vibrant character of Storozhenko. Not simply feel it, it's reflected in the concrete nature of his actions, statements, attitude towards events, and relationship with people. So basically, when he went to Murmizivka, he would also bring his friends. The well-known academic scholars used to visit it. And here we mention the teachers of the Moscow University, Ivan Garanzh, Maxim Kovalevsky. By the way, they also were of Ukrainian origin. And according to Mykola Volodymyrovich, Mykola from Kiev, he said students, teachers, a huge number of friends annually would come for at least a month to this village in the middle of nowhere that turned into the cultural center. He was not simply a scholar working at his desk. He spoke in Lochvitz at the People's House. He was a peace judge. He was a member of the group of local Lochvitzer farmers. He also founded a library. He established a hospital there. He even was helping people. Basically, he sometimes would even bring a doctor for the entire summer to the village. He even himself built a school. This is another thing that characterizes this professor very well. And his older son, after his wife passed away, was sent to go to his first Kiev gymnasium. And after his son graduated from there, he stayed in Ukraine. And he also stayed in Lochvitz. So basically, Storozhenko didn't forget about his motherland, and therefore Ukraine also remembered his figure. And I would like to mention how he was perceived in Ukraine while he was alive and after he passed away. In 1902, on the 35th anniversary of his teaching activities was celebrated not only in Moscow, in his university, but first and foremost in Lochvitz. And there was a huge article dedicated to that in Kievskaya Starina. And Ivan Franko contributed reviews to Storozhenko's works on Shevchenko. And for many years, one of the best guides for studying foreign literature was a brief outline of the history of Western European literature, a work published by Storozhenko students, translated into Ukrainian by Natalia Romanovich and Simon Petlura. And it was edited by Franko. Franko not only prepared course notes for full publication, but also added his own comments and bibliographical references to each chapter. And Franko considered this to be a catalyst for creating an image of the history of world literature in our language. And after Storozhenko passed away, the obituaries were published not only in Russia, but also in such journals as Київська історія, Громадська думка, Нова громада, записки наукового товариства імені Шевченка, Literary and Scientific Вісник. And notably, the memoirs of Kovalevsky, Ukrainian professor of law at Moscow University from Kharkiv, offer a noteworthy reflection on Storozhenko. He describes him in the following way: a nobleman from the Persian Cossacks who was a knight in his literary tastes. Also, another professor from Moscow University, Ivan Yanjel, mentioned him. One of the few people in the world who were as kind, cheerful, lively, and witty as he was. In his company, it was impossible to feel bored or let alone sad. Yes, I can tell that it is time to wind up. So there were lots of very positive comments about Storozhenko. People appreciated what he has done for Ukraine. They mentioned him as a Ukrainian, which mentioned both his appearance, his portrait, his behavior, as well as what he had on the inside. So they were taking into account the cognitive characteristics, how well he spoke Ukrainian, how well he knew literature, culture, and history, how he was sticking to the moral values of Ukrainians. And yet another thing is support of talented students from Ukraine. And here I would like to mention at least one name, Volodymyr Lazursky. It was his student. He came from Pereyaslav, the priest's son, who followed when he studied in Moscow and became a professor of Novorossiysk University and later on Odessa Institute of People Studies. So in all those memoirs, people felt also sad that as many of his contemporaries, he was not self-actualized in Ukraine enough. But all of these memoirs are very important for his biography as a renowned Ukrainian whose name, in our opinion, should find its place in our cultural context. We're not only talking about trying to nationalize the imperial context, but rather including such people as Storozhenko and other contemporaries who managed to stick to their identity even outside of Ukraine. And we believe that Storozhenko, who lived in Moscow, managed to be a worthy successor of his family's cultural legacy. A promising avenue for further research on the subject would be identification and integration of new biographical sources, particularly letters, anniversary articles, obituaries, memoirs from other contemporaries of Storozhenko, his students, as those offer insights into the significance of this remarkable figure in the development of Ukrainian science and culture. Thank you for your attention. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Halyna. Thank you so much for such an informative presentation. It's so inspiring to listen how you talk about Storozhenko and other people who were still trying to focus on our culture even during the times of the Russian Empire. Ladies and gentlemen, are there any questions or comments to Ms. Aleksandrova? Yes, Mariana, go ahead.
Доброго вечора в Україні, доброго дня.
Good evening from Ukraine and good morning to the US colleagues. Thank you so much for such an amazing presentation. I'm sorry because I came slightly late, so I have a question. Could you probably name a list of criteria according to which we cannot take a certain figure in culture or science, bring them back to the Ukrainian cultural field? Because, you know, I'm very curious about this kind of scholars, artists, painters, because, you know, it is one thing when that's how they identify themselves, and it's completely different story when they did not identify themselves as such. So what list of criteria is a solid one? Thank you. So the criteria, for example, let's take Mykola Storozhenko. What would be the list of criteria to bring him to the Ukrainian cultural field? Of course, not only his Ukrainian origin, because we know some Ukrainians who dissolved entirely in the empire. So, first, Ukrainian origin. Second, their Ukrainophile interests, studying Shevchenko, constantly trying to support his ties with Ukraine. He spent at least 4 months out of 12 annually in Murmizivka. All of his activities, also participation in Ukrainian nation-building processes. He funded Kievskaya Starina. He refused to take any money. He just wanted it to be published, and he even funded Shevchenko's relatives in the village. So all these criteria, I believe, at least when we take Mr. Storozhenko, are applicable to consider him as a Ukrainian, because, excuse me, he's not that well known in Russia either. And I can explain why he was silenced in Russia for a long time. Because he was the representative of science that later on was considered to be a bourgeois one. He did not only study Shakespeare, but also his predecessors. So he very clearly managed to trace the sources of where his art came from. So basically, Marlowe and other of Shakespeare's predecessors. And he was doing the comparative analysis to do that. And because he was doing this comparative studies, his name was basically eliminated and he was barely mentioned ever. They would simply say that, oh yeah, he was collecting some factual information. If we wouldn't take the history of Russian literary study, there's a lot of information about Potebnya. Yes, that's clear. About Ovsyannik Kulikovsky, yes, also a lot of information. A lot about Mykola Tashkevich, yes, they do embrace them as their scholars. But when it comes to Mykola Storozhenko, they barely mentioned him. Lately, they started publishing his research on Shakespeare more and more frequently, but our scholars do not use it that often. So basically, his name started coming back to science in the 50s. When comparative studies were rehabilitated as a science, because he's the representative of this Western approach to science. And when I am reading the publications of his students, and they are publishing publications about Shakespeare, and they did not mention his name at all, because he was the representative of this bourgeois old school. And basically, that is why he was let out. There was an anniversary, I think in 2009, if I'm not mistaken. And on the website of the university, there was a teeny tiny paragraph about him. There was a... Thank you. Thank you so much. You know, what you have just mentioned could set the groundwork for an additional research, how Russian scholars are also working with this heritage, what they are trying to eliminate, what they are still holding on to, what they are embracing, and how they're using that for their academic model. Yeah, sure, my pleasure. Thank you so much. Colleagues, anybody else? Oh, Nadia, go ahead.
Дякую, пані Галино. Чи ви мене чуєте?
Thank you, Halyna. Can you hear me well? Yes, thank you. My question basically is to add to the previous one, which came basically to the Shakespearean studies of his. From what I know, Natalia Torkett from Zaporizhzhia is going to publish a publication on Shakespeare. And how much Storozhenko is mentioned in the present-day contemporary discourse? Well, since I work at Vernadsky Library, I have looked through all of them. Sadly, he's barely mentioned in the contemporary Shakespeare studies discourse. Imagine, in England, 30 chapters by Robert Greene were published, and there was not even a single person who could write the biography and overview of his works. They asked Storozhenko, they translated his PhD publication, and it was the foreword for this 30 volumes. And I didn't mention that because I was predominantly speaking about how he was perceived in Ukraine. But, you know, if you look at it, he was number one, because I have already mentioned that he was the vice president of Shakespeare Society. So every time something was published in England, he either translated it or he both translated it. He wrote a review or foreword, preface, you name it. So basically, there is his bibliography available. Bibliography of Storozhenko's publications. It is not yet exactly full because it was a part of a publication which also included the works by his students, etc. Back when he was alive, there was a compilation published under the banner of science, it was styled, and his life was described there, and it also had a list of all of his works and publications, but some of his publications were published in Ukraine, in Kievskaya Starina, because he was not only researching Shevchenko alone. He was the first Ukrainian who was allowed to access the third department in St. Petersburg. He managed to do that via the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the fellow countryman, and he was simply sitting there and rewriting the unknown before Shevchenko's works. And he believed that, well, basically, he was handed over a case about the artist Shevchenko. And the next one that he worked on was dedicated to Kirilo and Methody fraternity. And later on, if we look at the scholars working on Shevchenko studies in the 20th centuries, yeah, clearly, now we have 3 thick volumes with all the information about Shevchenko case, but it was all initiated by Storozhenko, and we cannot forget about that. Thank you. Thank you so much, Halyna. Are there any more questions? Okay, sadly, the first seminar is coming to an end. Thank you one more time for such an informative presentation. Of course, it compels us to think about the national identity and culture. Sadly, we are short on time to ask any more questions and discuss it any further. But nevertheless, I hope that your research will motivate our colleagues to ask more questions and to further study this topic of cultural appropriation, memory, and national identity. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your attention, dear colleagues. You can send your questions to me, and I'd be happy to answer to them.